All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Tim McDonald and welcome to the Business of Speaking show. And today I'm so excited to have Sarah Wells joining me. How you doing, Sarah?
I'm so great. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and for those of you that don't know, this show is all about learning the journey of what got the speaker to the stage, not what they share on the stage, because we all know that if we've heard them speak. So it's like learning the stuff that we don't usually get to hear from speakers. And so Sarah just asked me a great question, who my audience was, and I'm still kind of defining that, but definitely people interested in getting involved in speaking, and those that, as we just kind of came up with the term, we're all going through a blockbuster moment right now, right? It's affecting our lives, and not by our choice necessarily, but we need to learn how to pivot our business if we want to stay involved in speaking. So that's kind of my two audiences that we're after. So Sarah, the one question I love to start with, just to kind of kick off the conversation, because we don't have any planned Q&A, is just kind
hmm
of telling us your story of how you actually got involved in speaking.
Yeah, so I am an Olympic athlete and I run hurdles. And so my story that I often share on stage is about overcoming life's hurdles. And it's about my journey as an Olympic athlete because the year before my first Olympics, I sat out with an injury that was supposed to take 3 months, ended up taking 9 months. And on my first day back to training, I got the word believe tattooed onto my wrist. And I said, when I make the Olympic Games, I'm going to put the Olympic rings underneath here. And so I just had this like relentless belief in myself. Long story short, 6 months later, I make the Olympic Games. And so blew my own mind. And I was like, oh my gosh, believing in yourself works. And then I was in university at the time. And so my parents were very proud and they started telling their friends, like, oh my gosh, my daughter, she did this thing, like she believed in herself and then she achieved this goal. Like, oh my gosh, can you believe it? And they were like, oh, come tell my kid that. And so I started just speaking at my parents' friends' kids' schools. And I didn't know it was an industry. I didn't know it was a thing. I just started showing up being like, hey, so I had this dream of going to the Olympics and I got the word believe tattooed on my wrist. And then I made the Olympics. And so you should believe in yourself. And here's how I think you could do that. And so when I started to get, one referral led to another, led to another, led to another, I was like, oh, this is a thing. And like, someone's going to pay me to do this. Like, this is amazing. And I really enjoyed it. I loved hearing how my story could impact those in the audience. And so I was like, okay, I should take this more seriously and started to actually work on crafting more of like an actual toolkit of like, okay, well, what does the PowerPoint look like? Like, what are my actual takeaways? Is that really the best story to explain this point? And started like really diving deeper and deeper and providing more value wherever I could. And that brought me to bigger stages, to different opportunities. And then as an athlete, I was still pursuing the Olympics for another Olympic quad. And so I was also gaining corporate sponsors. And as part of my contracts, because I loved speaking so much, I would include in the contract, like, okay, yes, this much sponsorship dollars or like product or whatever it is, but I'll also offer you like opportunities for me to come and inspire your workforce. And because I just loved it so much. So it was like as if I was giving them something, but really I just loved it. So I was like, this is a great deal for me. And then I started speaking on different stages like that. And so then I was kind of dabbling in these two worlds of the youth space as well as the corporate space. And what's really funny is that when I first started speaking, I thought like, okay, like this is exciting, but this one and done, you never see the audience again and there's no follow up. And so, how can I start creating something where there's a bit more of whether it's like programming following the event or something like that. And so the seed was in my head and I hadn't actually acted on it while I was still really focused on that next Olympic Games. Um, and by the time the Olympic Games came around 4 years later, after making it in 2012 at the London Olympics, 4 years later in 2016, I actually ended up getting injured just before the Olympic Games and missed qualifying by half a second. And that was devastating. And I took the year off sport because it was just really painful to go back to the track and I needed some time to heal and step away. And in that year was really when I was like, okay, well, I have the year off. Like, I've had this idea of creating some follow-up content and I want to do more than just when I'm on the stage specifically. And so how can I create some follow-up resources? And so I started to think about maybe I could do worksheets that were about different topics around challenging yourself. Like, what does that even mean when someone says challenging yourself? I could do stuff around grit, about ambition, about discipline. And I created these like kind of follow-up resources to give to companies and schools after I left. And we got 0 downloads, 0 of these worksheets. And it started to kind of ring in for me that it was actually because it wasn't necessarily supplementary. It was largely like additional. Like, it didn't seem like the program kept going. It just seemed like this like additional thing they had to do. And so that was a whole learning lesson. And I'm sure you might have another question that leads into this later, but how I ended up modifying from that, we can share in a bit.
No, I please just go on that, because that's exactly what I'm thinking.
like,
I mean, how do you? I'm like, did you look at your wrist again and say believe? And
right. Well, what I ended up doing actually was, in that year off, I was sitting down, I was keynote speaking for RBC. I don't know how many viewers of yours will be American, but that's the biggest Canadian bank. And so I sat next to the chief marketing officer, and she was like, what do you like to do outside of sport? And I said, well, I have this idea. I want to, help people build self-belief through action. That's what I did in the Olympics, and blah, 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 blah. I told her my whole story that I usually share on stage. And she was like, oh my gosh, I love this. And so we started putting together, with the help of RBC, which became our corporate partner, how we could actually do a tour of speaking events across the country, and not just leave worksheets, but actually create curriculum that was tied into the Ministry of Education program. So that way the teachers wouldn't have to do something extra. It was actually taking something off their plate with like a plug and play, here's your resource. And the students were all bought in, because we came in and we did this epic day where I spoke on stage and did my keynote, and then we did workshops. And by the end of the day, all the students pick a Believe passion project that they then pursue once I leave for 3 months. And then I come back at the end of that, and they showcase what they did. And suddenly I found this like new secret weapon, that it was far easier to get people to say yes to that keynote speaking event when I could show them how it integrated in with their deliverables that they needed to do as a school system. And from that, now I've spoke to over 100,000 students across the country. And we just got our license to be able to go down and speak in the US with the Believe Initiative, is what the program is called. And so it's been this like really interesting journey of originally just doing something interesting, like make the Olympics. And I'm sure many of your audience will have a story like this, of whether it's like you climbed a mountain, you overcame an illness, you built a business, you were like vulnerable and overcame something that was like super challenging, whatever that is, you have a story worth telling. And then it's like someone is like, ooh, someone else should hear this. And then that snowballs, and then you do another opportunity. And then you start realizing like, okay, well, how can I create a bigger impact? And you try stuff. Sometimes it won't work, like mine. And other times it'll be the exact thing that leads you to that next opportunity, and like the new holistic image of what your speaking business can entail. And so it was just kind of random.
I'm not a big believer in like playing the game of what if, but if you'll oblige me just for this time, if you weren't sitting next to that CMO of RBC,
Right.
what do you think would have happened?
I honestly think I would have found a way, because I was taking the year off. And so I had all this extra time when I wasn't training. I think I would have done something. We wouldn't have grown as quickly as we have. Like in 2.5 years, we probably wouldn't have touched 100,000 students. But I think it would have been smaller scale, taking those steps forward. And that's what I think is really exciting about anyone interested in coming into the speaking industry, is that just because you hear of these stories of people on stages, and I've been fortunate to be in stadiums of 20,000 people and share that story, and that's exciting. But there's so many different avenues where you can create massive impact, and you don't have to have those like big stages to do so. That there's so many organizations, not-for-profits, corporations, schools, universities, clubs, like all of these different things that need someone to help fill the knowledge gaps, whether that's in the form of inspiration or motivation or your unique skill set, whatever that is. And so I think like you can find a way no matter what your message is or what impact you want to make. And I think I was of that mindset in that year off, that I was going to find a way to get this story out there.
I'm so glad I asked that question, because I think so many people, especially when they're starting, they hear other people's stories and they just think, oh, well, if I had the help of, the CMO at RBC, I could have done that too, but I don't have that, and so it's like just hearing from you, I think the persistence and the resilience that you have, even if you know yourself so well that it seems like it wouldn't have mattered if you were sitting next to that person or somebody else, and if it was small or a large impact right away, you would have kept pushing forward.
Yeah, totally. And like, I don't even mean to like put myself on this like, oh, I'm always motivated, because for sure there are days where I'm like, why am I even trying? This is so stupid. Like I'm one person. Like this, I watch this person grow at this rate. Like I am so like measly compared to them. Like what am I even thinking? And so we all have those moments, and that's natural, and that's gonna occur at least in like certain waves. But it's like you don't have to have someone create the opportunity for you. Like you are very much in control of defining your own outcome. And absolutely there's ways that progression is kind of can escalate more quickly when you're given certain resources. And like, don't get me wrong, I feel so fortunate that that was my circumstance. But there's also things that you can do that are in your control to help climb that staircase a lot faster. And it's like, we're so lucky that there's websites like you can go on Eventbrite and find like countless like LinkedIn meetups or different kind of like entrepreneurship conferences or summits or little things like that. And you could say like, hey, I'm a new speaker. I speak about this, but I'd love to like have an opportunity to share my message with your audience. And especially if you're willing to kind of either have a super low price or do it for free to get the credibility, to get, bring a videographer, 100% bring a videographer to get footage of you on stage. And then it's like you start creating that package by like creating that opportunity for yourself. And then once you have the package, you can start applying to bigger stages and different events. And it doesn't have to be that you have the whole story or you have the whole package all at once. You just need to get your first gig. And then your first gig can lead to your second gig. And then your second gig can help you gain enough footage to create a highlight reel. And then once you have your highlight reel, then you can start applying for those bigger stages. Once you have one bigger stage, you leverage that for your next big stage. Once you have that next big stage, you start like meeting other people in the industry, and you can now start leveraging those relationships, see where they've spoken, what other opportunities are out there. And so it's just simply get a gig. That's step one.
There's something interesting in my mind as you've shared what you've shared so far. When you went through, your goal of getting on the Olympic team, it was a very defined goal that you knew what you wanted to do. When you took the year off and you were looking to explore, kind of expanding on your speaking and making a greater impact, did you have that clear defined goal, or was it something that you needed to kind of just kind of feel your way through before it became a little bit clearer for you?
Yeah, I love that you asked that question, because I've been coaching a bunch of entrepreneurs who want to get into this world of running a program or an initiative, either online or in person. And we talked about this week, about how sometimes finding out something is not a thing is a thing. Because I didn't know getting into the speaking world or taking that year off, like, okay, what does my life look like by the end of this year? I had no idea. But I just kept kind of following the next opportunity or like my curiosity, and just kept seeing, okay, what's that next step? Okay, and what new tier has this showed me? Okay, and then I took another step, and like, what new tier has this showed me? And a great example of this is actually like kind of my progression even through sport, because originally I actually got cut from every single high school team. Like I wasn't a good athlete, but track and field didn't make cuts. So I made that team. And because I did track and field, I knew that in university, I wanted to study kinesiology to learn what was happening to my body in training. And then because I did kinesiology, I think I was able to understand what was happening. And so I was able to squeeze out like 1 or 2% more out of every single workout because I knew why I needed to push myself that hard. And so because I had 1 to 2% more like drive in every single workout, I think that helped me become an Olympian. And then because I was an Olympian, I was able to start sharing my story on stages. Because I started sharing my story on stages, I now had this platform where I wanted to make a greater impact. Because I knew I wanted to make a greater impact, I've started creating those follow-up resources and programming. Because I started doing that programming, I've had further opportunity to get on more stages. And now I'm here. At no point did I say, when I set out in high school to do track and field, like, where this will lead me? Probably the Olympics and then stages in front of 20,000 people. And then I'll create a program and then that will be the best life ever. Like, no, I did not have that plan. And none of us really have to have that plan. But if you're enjoying what you're doing, if you're following your curiosity, you're taking one step at a time, you're doing, like I said, like, if I have an expertise in like early stage entrepreneurship, and I love speaking about that. And I have a story about how I overcame kind of the burnout and all of the adversity you face in that first year of starting a startup. I know I could help someone who's going through that. Okay, well, how can you get in front of that audience? Step one is just look online, like find some of those, and then who knows who you meet at that event and what that leads to and what that leads to and what that leads to, similar to my journey. And so I think we can overwhelm ourselves thinking we have to know exactly what the finish line looks like. And I think you should absolutely have an ambition and an understanding of like kind of the elements that you want success to feel and look like, but you don't have to have the details so ironed out that you can't take that step one. Like, you don't need to know where you're going so accurately to take your first step. And so having just a general principle of like, I would like to do more speaking, and that might look like a balance between like 50% my day job and 50% kind of on the road or, virtually these days, sharing my story. Okay, well, what are the ways you can find that balance? Because there's many different avenues you could take to do that exact same outcome.
Fantastic. Well, I know, we're getting close to the end of our time, and I just feel like
wow, it's flying by.
I know I could go on for like another hour with you, I'm sure, but one thing that I always like to ask, and I know you kind of already answered this, but let me ask it a little bit differently because I don't think you've answered this. If you could go back knowing what you know now to when you first got started, what piece of advice would you be giving yourself?
I think, I mean, it's maybe a little bit redundant, but not entirely, but you don't have to have your first speech like perfect. And again, I'll kind of like bring this back to my sport, and how I see this is, if I don't run my race and learn, okay, I screwed up at hurdle 5 because, I didn't drive my arms, or until you live the experience, it's sometimes hard to see where there's room for improvement. And so sometimes we want to wait till like everything is so perfect and the speech is great and we know our stuff like inside and out, and you want to know it fairly well. You don't want to, present yourself in a bad light, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think I've learned the quickest when I've just kind of thrown myself into it, like creating this, I was just talking to you about recently this week. I had that conversation with the group that I'm coaching through launching their own initiative. And so that started only since quarantine. And so I've thrown myself to the wolves of like, okay, learn how to coach online. Like, it's not just about doing keynotes and workshops in person, but like, how do I create programming that's engaging, that's like inspiring, is insightful, is helpful through an online program? And so I actually pitched the program before I ever actually even created it to see if people had an interest. And I've learned so much through that process, and I'm realizing how much opportunity is in front of me now through the online world to supplement all my speaking. And had I not have just kind of forced myself into that before having anything, then I wouldn't be in the position I'm in today, now suddenly finding a new avenue of business. And so if you don't have your speech written, if you know what you would talk about, but it's not, you don't have your deck built, you don't have the things, like, I would honestly, and this isn't necessarily for everyone, But I would honestly go find an event, put myself with a stake in the ground of like, okay, well, I'm presenting August 15th and today is June 16th. And so I'm going to like know that in the next 2 months, I want to craft my 20-minute kind of like mini keynote so that I'm ready. And it won't be perfect. And there'll be many things you need to improve after that first one. But by putting yourself out there, you're going to learn so much faster and so much quicker than you ever would waiting for the perfect opportunity with the perfect speech and the perfect deck and the perfect examples. And so I think early on in my career, I was really afraid of throwing myself out there. And recently, I've seen the benefit of pitching the idea before you even have it built.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I think so many of us can relate to that, especially with what's been going on in the world today. So,
Yeah.
but tell people, where they can find you, how they can connect with you, Sarah.
Yeah, so I am highly involved on social media. Instagram, you can find me Sarah Wells 400mh, like Sarah Wells 400-meter hurdles. It's a big regret on that handle choice, but and then you can also visit my website sarahwells.ca, or if you're interested in seeing more about the program that I spoke about that I've now been taking across the country, that's believeinitiative.com. So Sarah Wells 400mh or sarahwells.ca. And then believeinitiative.com is our organization.
Well, fantastic. And we're going to sign off of the YouTube live now. And for those of you that don't know, I stay on with Sarah and ask her one additional question. And we send that out to our email subscribers. So if you haven't already joined, head over to speaking.business and join the community, and you will be signed up to get these emails that come out weekly with all this good insight that our speakers are sharing with us. And I can't wait to ask Sarah her question now. So thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks so much.
Okay, we are done on YouTube. Let me
Awesome.